Hello, I'm Congressman Steve King, and I represent Iowa's 4th Congressional District, 39 counties in northwest, north central Iowa. And I've done that for 17 years, going on 18. And we've focused a lot on our agriculture products. 4th District is the #1 egg-producing congressional district in all of America. And I'm happy to say that we're thankful that our former Governor Branstad is now Ambassador Branstad to China. We have solidified the first phase of the Chinese trade deal, and that does so much good for all the products coming out of Iowa. And it's the best component, of course, of any Chinese trade deal that might come along in phase 2 or any phase beyond that. So we're happy about that. We want to keep selling products to China. We're not against investing capital there when it does the true, right, and just thing. And yet, as I've looked at this years ago, I went over to China to raise the issue of their theft of our intellectual property, their piracy. And I went through 5 cities to hear their briefings. And in those, by the time I got to the beginning of the briefing in Beijing, the 3rd city, I was hearing exactly the same script. And I knew I didn't have to listen anymore because I'd already heard it twice. So I wrote a bill that directs the trade representative to conduct a study to determine the value of U.S. intellectual property pirated by the Chinese, apply a duty to products coming from China to the United States in an amount equivalent to recover that value, and then distribute it to the rightful property rights holders. Well, that bill got some traction, and then we got pushback from places like Hollywood and Nashville, which still doesn't make sense to me. But I've always kept that bill in front of things in Congress while I've been there. I presented it to the president here about a year ago or more, and he said he likes it, take it to Larry Kudlow and Peter Navarro. I had already done that. I went back and refreshed that. That's kind of the basis of my interest in what's going on. But what I'm seeing is this, that I want to continue promoting our exports into China. I want to trade with them. But the asymmetrical positions that they have been taking cause me great concern for the long term. And so I'm hopeful that the American people and our leaders especially will be aware of what I have been able to gather here and what goes beyond my knowledge base. But I'm very grateful to have had a long relationship with Frank Gaffney, the president of the Center for Security Policy, and who's now here this morning to head up the Committee on the Present Danger of China. And so I'm looking forward to also the presentation of each of the gentlemen that are here at the table to start this informational process so that we can make the peaceful, incremental, logical moves necessary so that those things I see coming together that are directly against the long-term interests of the United States can be dealt with in that peaceful, logical way rather than have things come to some kind of a place where it gets really, I'll say, high risk for either society. That's my view on this, and there's a lot I could say about the things I think I know, but I know Frank Gaffney knows a lot more than I do. So I'd like to turn this microphone over to Frank Gaffney.
Congressman, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us and for being so welcoming to this community. We're delighted to be here in Iowa on the eve of course, its very important role with respect to selection of a next candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States. This is a backdrop for our conversation. We are not here in a partisan capacity. This is not a political event. This is simply meant to be an opportunity to inform both those who will be casting votes in this coming caucus in Iowa and those who hope to get those votes about the present and growing danger from communist China. I'm here not in my capacity as now the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy. We have helped sponsor rather a project called Committee on the Present Danger China to use the resources of an extraordinary group of people, Joseph Bosco being one of them here as a founding member of that committee, as well as other friends and colleagues who I will be describing and introducing in a moment, Sean Lin and Roger Robinson, to help tell the story about what China is up to and what it will mean for us if we fail to recognize the nature of what it's up to and deal with it effectively. In addition to talking about the problem of China, specifically the problem posed by the Chinese Communist Party that runs China, for the purposes of informing the job of the next commander-in-chief, the person who plays that role, we're also going to be talking about a very troubling phenomenon that we think has particular relevance to state legislators and people at the executive level in this state as well, namely the involvement of China in our capital markets and how that is translating into empowering and enabling the Chinese to be the threat that they are becoming day by day. Let me just give you a little bit of background on the Committee on the Present Danger. This is a group that has had several incarnations in the past. It was most importantly, I think, in the mid-1970s, a vehicle for undertaking a similar kind of educational effort to the one that we're talking about today. It was mounted in part in support of the thinking and ideas and ambitions of a fellow by the name of Ronald Reagan, who was one of its founding members. Ronald Reagan and the others on the Committee on the Present Danger, Present Danger, used this run-up to the 1980 election to articulate an alternative strategy to that of engagement, if you will, or détente, as it was called at the time, with the Soviet Union, namely underwriting it and otherwise enabling it to persist, something that successive American governments, Republican and Democratic and foreign allies of ours, had done a lot of. The Committee on the Present Danger helped articulate an alternative strategy that I think could be described as rolling back the Soviet Union, something that President Reagan, when he was a candidate, ran on in 1980, and ultimately, when he was elected, secured a mandate to execute. And that strategy subsequently informed his presidency. It became the thrust of his efforts vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And as they say, the rest is history. Thanks in part to the work of the Committee on the Present Danger, President Reagan successfully brought down the Soviet empire, freeing hundreds of millions of people. President Reagan warned long before he became president, frankly, but throughout his career, about the existential threats to freedom that every generation faces. His was the Soviet Union, most especially, before that, Nazism and fascism. We have today a new existential threat to freedom in the form of communist China. And what we are here to do today is to describe in some detail the various forms that existential threat takes, the extent to which it must be properly understood and properly responded to. And I have to say, again, without being partisan about it, that the need for this here in Iowa and across the country is all the more obvious because there has been some lack of clarity, frankly, on the part of some of the candidates for the Democratic nomination, notably former Vice President Joe Biden, whose position has shifted from China is not a problem to China is a problem, back to China is not a problem in just the space of the past few months. We want to make sure that his understanding of this formidable foe is articulated so that the American people can understand it, as must be that of every other candidate for the job of Commander-in-Chief. And every bit as important that we understand what they would do about this existential threat to freedom. So we will have 3 presentations this morning talking about different aspects of the problem. The first will be by Joseph Bosco. Joe is an attorney by training, Harvard trained, including under Henry Kissinger, who was his professor for a time when he was in law school there. He went on to become a very senior official in the U.S. Defense Department, the desk officer whose responsibilities included Communist China. He has been very active on the public policy front for years, both in government, of course, and out, including now writing frequently for the Hill newspaper in Washington. Joe is going to talk about kind of the geostrategic context in which we have to understand what China is up to, as well as some of the most alarming elements of what it is up to. He will be followed by Dr. Sean Lin. Dr. Lin is a Chinese expat who survived the massacre in Tiananmen Square, where he was one of the student protesters. Dr. Lin is these days the executive director of the Global Alliance Against Communist Propaganda and Disinformation. He is a practitioner of Falun Gong, and for that he has been persecuted, has had many of his co-religionists, including detained in China for a time. He also served in the United States Army for 9 years, initially as an enlisted officer, then as a commissioned officer, rising to the rank of captain. Interestingly enough, and I consider this actually quite providential, given some of the things we need to talk about today, his last duty station in the Army was as the laboratory director at the Viral Disease Branch of the Army's Walter Reed Institute of Research. He will be talking about what the Communist Party of China is doing to its own people, both religious followers and others, and how they're doing it, with what technology they're doing it, and the effects on those people. I hope that he will also talk a bit about what is currently being afflicted upon those people, and perhaps speculate with us as to why, in the form of this coronavirus that is now achieving, it seems, at least initial stages of epidemic, if not pandemic, proportions as an affliction on the people of China and quite possibly the rest of us around the world as well. We will have joining us by videotape, thirdly, another distinguished contributor by the name of Roger Robinson. Roger served in the Reagan administration on the National Security Council staff. He was really instrumental in helping President Reagan translate the strategy that I was talking about a moment ago into an operational plan, which was executed with decisive effect in the economic warfare space, specifically against the Soviet Union. Roger has gone on to do several things as the president and founder of RWR Advisory Group, and also as the chairman of the Prague Security Studies Institute. And he will be talking by videotape with us today about specifically how we, in the United States, through our capital markets, are actually underwriting and enabling what China is up to in so many of these threatening ways. We will be then happy to take questions and have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves about what now must be done in light of all of this. And we very much appreciate those of you who are following our proceedings by live stream or by videotape, and look forward to the feedback that we hope we will have to this vitally important program. The first in a series of similar kinds of threat briefings. The Committee on the Present Danger China will be sponsoring in states where elections will be taking place shortly. We will be in New Hampshire a week from today and South Carolina 2 weeks from tomorrow, in the interest of similarly informing the election debate and state legislators about the problem that their public pension funds are investing in Chinese companies that constitute threats to us, to our allies, to people elsewhere around the world, and of course, to the Chinese people themselves. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Joe Bosco, and appreciate very much his being here as well as his insights on this important topic. Joe.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning to our audience. When John Kennedy and Richard Nixon ran for president in 1960, they agreed in the debate they had that Red China was a serious threat to the United States. Kennedy had written a book called While England Slept, describing the failure of the free world to recognize the threat, the rising threat, from Nazi Germany in the 1930s and early 1940s. The question today for us is, why have so many people been so wrong about China for so long? After 40 years of American engagement policy, government officials and foreign policy experts are discovering a very real China threat coming at us from several directions: economic, diplomatic, ideological, and most seriously, militarily. But we should not deceive ourselves. The threat has been there for all this time. It has just grown so large and so real that it can no longer be ignored, dismissed, or papered over with wishful thinking. To understand where we are and how we got into this predicament, dangerous as it is important to return to when it all started, with then President Nixon's opening to China in 1972. Before he began that initiative, and as he was launching his second presidential campaign, Nixon had published a foreign affairs article laying out what he hoped to accomplish as president with China. The year was 1967. Mao Zedong was in the middle of his Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward, in which 50 million Chinese died. The United States and China had already fought a 3-year war after North Korea and China had invaded South Korea. China had also invaded and occupied Tibet and East Turkestan, now called Xinjiang province. And Chinese Communist forces were at that very time killing Americans in South Vietnam, with both China and the Soviet Union providing the weapons and supplies to keep the war going indefinitely. China was a declared enemy of the United States and the entire Western world, and was actively fomenting wars of national liberation throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That was the China Nixon knew he would confront after he won the presidency. And he was determined to do something about it, to change the perilous spiral we were on with China, or rather that China was on with the entire civilized world. He argued American policy must urgently recognize the present and potential danger from communist China and take measures to deal with that danger. Nixon foresaw a dire future for the world if things did not change and China was not brought into the international community. He said, "We simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors. There is no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation." Nixon said it was essential to persuade China that it must change, that it cannot satisfy its imperial ambitions, and must turn away from foreign adventuring. He warned, the world cannot be safe until China changes. But he said there were right and wrong ways to get China to change. He rejected the idea of conceding to China a sphere of influence in the Asian mainland and extending even to the islands beyond. He said neither the United States, as an Asian power, nor its regional allies could accept that outcome. Next, Nixon ruled out preemptive war, which he said could escalate into World War III. He also warned against making unilateral concessions to accommodate China, as he put it, rushing to grant recognition to Peking, to admit it to the United Nations, and ply it with offers of trade. all of which would serve to confirm its rulers in their present course. Instead, Nixon said, America needs a policy of firm restraint, of no reward or a creative counterpressure designed to persuade Beijing that its interests can only be served by accepting the basic rules of international civility. He called it a policy of dynamic detoxification, both to keep the peace and to help draw out the poison from the thoughts of Mao. The question is, when Nixon finally became president and had the opportunity to put those principles into effect, did he follow them, dealing with China and getting it to change its attitudes toward the outside world? It is worth noting that Nixon's junior partner in the China opening, his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, did not share the president's urgent desire for communist China to change its policies. Though the former Harvard professor had never devoted any of his professional career to China, his only interest was in playing the so-called China card against the Soviet Union for the sake of détente. He also wanted China to help the United States achieve a face-saving withdrawal from the war in Vietnam. Nixon put Kissinger in charge of negotiating the terms of his visit to China, but he cautioned him, quote, "We cannot be too forthcoming in terms of what America will do. We'll withdraw from Taiwan, and we'll do this, and we'll do that, and other things," unquote. Yet in the end, the two realists did exactly that. In return for promises on Vietnam that were never fulfilled and a Soviet détente that never worked, the US began making concessions. Even before Nixon went to China, it withdrew its forces from Taiwan, pulled the 7th Fleet out of the Taiwan Strait, where it had been since the Korean War, and agreed to switch US diplomatic relations from Taiwan to Communist China in Nixon's expected second term. The Shanghai Communique, the original sin of US-China relations, contained ambiguous language about one China that Beijing has used ever since to falsely claim Washington agrees that Taiwan is part of China. When Mao said he could wait 100 years before using force against Taiwan, Kissinger asked why he would wait so long. That set the pattern of accommodationist US-China policy for the next 4 decades. Years later, Nixon, seeing no change in Beijing's anti-Western behavior, expressed regrets at what he had accomplished, saying, "We may have created a Frankenstein." He also said democratic Taiwan is permanently separated from China. Kissinger, however, has built his entire post-government career on the original deal, advising both Chinese and American leaders to stick with it. He has publicly warned Taiwan that China will not wait forever. President Jimmy Carter in 1979 completed the Nixon-Kissinger plan to officially abandon Taiwan. An outraged Congress quickly passed the Taiwan Relations Act, committing the US to maintain unofficial relations and sell arms for Taiwan's self-defense. The TRA also said it would consider any threat to regional stability as a matter of grave concern, though it did not specifically pledge the US to come to Taiwan's defense. An opportunity to clarify America's commitment came in 1995-96, when China showed its displeasure at Taiwan's first direct presidential election by firing missiles across the Taiwan Strait. President Clinton initially sent an aircraft carrier, but backed off when Beijing said US ships would face a sea of fire. Chinese military officials asked Assistant Secretary of State Joseph Nye what the US would do if China actually attacked Taiwan. Instead of referring to the Taiwan Relations Act to show America's commitment to a secure Taiwan, Nye said, quote, "We don't know and you don't know. It would depend on the circumstances." That statement of strategic ambiguity has been U.S. policy ever since. Beijing took great encouragement from the answer. It devoted the next 25 years to building a massive military to create the circumstances that would deter Washington from intervening when China attacked Taiwan. It includes an arsenal of attack submarines and anti-ship ballistic missiles to keep the Seventh Fleet away. A Chinese admiral recently said, sinking a U.S. carrier or two would kill 5,000 to 10,000 sailors and teach America a lesson. To a large extent, the strategy has worked. Until the Trump administration, the U.S. Navy has mostly kept out of the Taiwan Strait and ignored China's massive island-building campaign and militarization in the South China Sea, which Beijing now claims as its territorial waters, despite a United Nations ruling against it. Chinese ruler Xi Jinping has been blatant in asserting Beijing's claims also in the East China Sea and through his Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. He says China is merely reestablishing the ancient Silk Road trade routes, but Xi is actually using China's economic power to entangle poor countries in debt traps and security arrangements that end up extending China's strategic power globally. It should be remembered that his predecessor, Deng Xiaoping, advocated a deceptive Machiavellian strategy for China as it built up its economic and military power. He instructed Chinese officials, hide your capabilities and bide your time. Western experts thought Deng was a charming and clever little fellow, but they never bothered to ask what he was hiding and what China was biding its time for. Xi Jinping has torn off the mask and revealed for all to see in his China dream that Communist China's aggressive ambitions have never ameliorated, never changed or gone away. After 4 decades of generous Western engagement, investment, and technology transfer, it is still, as Nixon first described it, a regime with imperial ambitions. Despite being inside the family of nations now, it still, in Nixon's words, nurtures its fantasies, cherishes its hates, and threatens its neighbors. Whoever the next commander-in-chief is, he or she will face the same hostile adversary Nixon did. But thanks to misguided U.S. policies over that time, it will be a far more powerful and dangerous one. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very much for that comprehensive review of how we got here and the mistakes that have been made and the implications of allowing those kinds of mistakes to be perpetuated into the future. This is, of course, exactly the topic at hand. To help us understand what this all has meant for the people of China, I'm very pleased to have with us, as I've mentioned, Dr. Sean Lin. And Sean, I hope you'll talk based on your own experience about the persecution of the Chinese people, including, of course, Falun Gong and other religious communities, as well as the latest information we have on the possible provenance of this coronavirus and its implications, both for the Chinese and us.
Thank you. My name is Sean Lin. Really my honor to join this panel, and thank you, Frank, Congressman, and Joe. I'm really glad to be here today. So, talk about Chinese Communist parties. Okay. So, talk about Chinese Communist parties' impact on its own people. First, I want to share a little bit about what I've experienced on the Tiananmen Square massacre, because I think also kind of implicate what we experienced later on. So I was with the student group that was on the square on the night of the massacre, and we withdrew as a last group, several hundred students withdrew as the last group from the southeast corner of the Tiananmen Square, and then we're heading north. So at the time, the PLA already, People Liberation Army already entered the market, and they already opened the files, and you hear the gunshot hitting the monument. Pa, 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 pa. It's very clear gunshot. And then when we head in north, and we see a tank rolling, passing by, and as students, kind of first time seeing the tank, and many students were scared. So one male student actually was petrified, and then he fell down on the street. So at the time, the tank already passed, but it stopped, and then intentionally rolled back, crashed the head of the student. It was totally shocking experience. 30 years passed by. I never forget that moment when I see people's skull. It's just like a piece of paper on the ground. This story kind of remind me what we experienced later on in the past 30 years. We always hope the worst part is already passed, just like the tank already passed by. But you didn't expect it rolled back. It did even more terrible things to the Chinese people. So, for example, in the last 2-3 decades, Chinese government has launched very systematic crackdown persecution against basically all religions. And one clear example is the Falun Gong group. So the government started persecution in July 1999. And after that, millions of people lost their job, lose their homes, detained, kidnapped, tortured, and many were persecuted to death. And one of the worst crimes they have done on the Falun Gong group is also organ harvesting. It's organ harvesting on live person. So basically, they use the technology to build a nationwide network of this information, of the blood type, the tissue type of these people being incarcerated. And then once you have this network, so anywhere nationwide, if you have a need for a particular blood type, tissue type, and they can quickly identify the person being incarcerated in prison, and then they can go to the prison to kill them, take the organ on site, and then quickly bring it back to the hospitals. And this crime was originally exposed in 2003, but after that, the Chinese Communist Party keep changing their narrative to defend their practice. So at the beginning, they said, we only use organs from executed prisoners. Later on, they found that the number of executed prisoners only 3,000, 4,000 a year. It could not measure up the explosion of transplant case in China since 2000. So they changed it. They say we actually also use some people from the labor camp. They cannot deny the case happened in the labor camps. And then they also say, we build out our voluntary systems, because in the past, China had no voluntary registration system for organ donation, because it's against Chinese people's traditional belief to donate organs. People want to have a complete body even after death. So they said, we have this volunteer system built nationwide. But even last year, if you check on China's voluntary registration system, it's very pathetic numbers. And you can imagine, even in the United States, with a very complete healthy registration system, people still need to wait 2 years, 3 years for a kidney transplant, or maybe 10 years for a liver transplant. But in China, the hospital promise, come here, in 2 weeks, we find you a kidney match. Even just 1 month to 2 months, find you a liver transplant. And there are cases like many patients from Taiwan, like for example, go to China. One case I saw, even one person, he had 8 times of transplant of kidneys, because the match may not work well. So a few months later, the organ failed again, and he go back to China again and quickly get another transplant. So can you imagine this heinous crime? It's a nationwide crime to systematic government sanctioned organ harvesting on people, and it becomes such a lucrative business. So many hospitals engage in this, not just military hospitals, civilian hospitals, all engaging there. And made huge profit. If you do a liver transplant, they're asking, especially foreigners, $300,000, $400,000 for organ transplant. So it starts supporting the business growing very rapidly in China. And this practice also influenced other neighboring countries as well. So even in the United States, more people want to go to China for organ transplant. So it's called organ tourism. Yeah, so it's a very terrible situation. And so far, very few countries have been taking actions against this organ tourism. One actually effective measure is from Israel. Yeah, so they use health insurance policy to limit people going to China. So this practice also expanded to not only just the Falun Gong group, then Uyghur group, and many other underground Christians, Church of Almighty. Many people got incarcerated, also face the danger of organ harvesting as well. And now China has built its own surveillance system, nationwide surveillance system. So they're systematically collecting biometric information, blood samples from people imprisoned in China, and facial recognition technologies, organ recognitions, so many different advanced technologies being integrated together and to boost their AI technology as well. So in this way, they can build this surveillance state to control people, and at the same time, they can utilize your organ if they need it. So this is a crime not only to Chinese people, it's a crime against humanity, and still ongoing very rampantly in China. So at the same time, we also understand Chinese government is not just using this technology to support the development of AI technology. Chinese military also have been advertising strongly for military-civil engagement together, to develop technology together. So Chinese military high-ranking officer has been talking about to maintain or to develop a dominance on biotechnologies. So it became a common language for Chinese military high-ranking officer to support new development biotechnology, including genetic editing, as well the potential of infectious disease as a potential bioweapons. And so this is actually several high-ranking PLA military officers talk about these potentials. So this lead to another potential that Chinese government, besides supporting the chemical weapon to Iran and these rogue states, they may themselves develop advanced biotechnology weapons or chemical weapons. So right now, there are a lot of media attention on potential connection of the Wuhan coronavirus connection with institute in Wuhan. This is Institute of Virology, and also there's a national microbiology lab in Wuhan. So recent report this morning we saw is actually mentioned a Canadian scientist in the National Microbiology Lab actually was caught transporting very dangerous Ebola virus and Nipah virus back to China, and actually into Wuhan. And her husband actually originally is from Institute of Virology in Wuhan. So the media has been suspecting is there any connection, the Chinese government using the virus that they developed to use it in the process of military bioweapon development. So of course this had to be further investigated and need additional evidence. But it just happened to be coincide together in the same location in Wuhan city. So there's a lot of question on this one. And also talk about the outbreak of the coronavirus from Wuhan. I think it's also present another aspect, the Chinese government's threat to the world, because the incompetence and poor management of an outbreak, epidemic in China, it can lead to a pandemic to the threat globally. And clearly, even now, the Chinese government still has not completely revealed the true situations in Wuhan and many other cities. And there are many videos from internet, from Weibo, from WeChat, from medical staffs in Wuhan hospital talking about the real number of people got infected is more than 90,000. and while the officials only talk about 2,000 cases. And you see videos on the internet, so many people just like drop dead like flies on the street, in the hospitals, while the official number is only in 50s. So, and so many people wait hours in a hospital try to get treated. But eventually, the doctor said, we don't have authority to actually confirm your case. Because how many cases can be confirmed as a real infection by the novel coronavirus is dictated by the government. It's not by the medical doctor. You have to give an authority in order to declare you are being confirmed the coronavirus infection. So under this situation, so many Wuhan people were in a great danger. Yesterday, Wuhan mayor had a press conference, and he had to admit about 5 million Wuhan people already left the city prior to their close down all the transportation. Because this is a peak travel time in China for the Lunar New Year. So imagine 5 million people already spread out throughout China. And how many people come to overseas, right? So we see 4 confirmed cases in the United States now, and many other neighboring countries, Singapore, Thailand, Korea, Taiwan, so many other countries already have confirmed case. While China still try to portray that it used a very strong measures to contain the virus. And the government have been boosting, they have tried to build an ad hoc hospital with more than 1,000 beds in Wuhan. But the hospital will only be ready until February the 2nd. So what about people for these 10 days? They had to still do their self-quarantine at home. And maybe many people still try to find a hospital to get treatment. So these people carrying the virus still walking around in the cities. While government can even simply use some of the hotels or some temporary shelters to help treat these people in a more protective areas, or use set up temporary quarantine areas. But the government didn't want to do that. They want to show the world, I'm able to use massive resource to build a hospital, but it takes 10 days. So anyway, a lot of the corruption, poor management in this process. We saw many of the doctors crying on their own videos, saying they were so desperate. They're completely out of the mask, protection gowns, medical supplies, and the government still try to portray to the world they are doing a great job in containing the virus. So I think this is another example how big a threat a Communist Party can bring to the world, even just from public health aspect. So finally, I want to say that, even though the phase 1 trade deal is already done with China, but I think the whole world still need to keep in mind, if you ask Chinese communist regime to be more democratic, to be more transparent, to be more open and really serve the people, it's like asking the tiger to change its skin. It's very, very, very difficult, almost impossible. Thank you.
Unlikely, more to the point. Dr. Lin, thank you very much. This is an incredibly compelling testimony from firsthand experience and that of your community, as well as what is being afflicted upon Uyghur Muslims, as you mentioned, Christians, Tibetans, Buddhists, and others, and the Chinese people themselves. So we appreciate very much your adding that into the mix. Next, we're going to hear via video from Roger Robinson of the Prague Security Studies Institute. He is also the president of RWR Advisory Group. And we have a short paper available about some of the companies that he's going to be talking about that are now present in the Iowa Public Employee Retirement Systems portfolio, as best we can tell. And he will tell us more about that and its implications in this video.
Legislators of Iowa need to understand that the Iowa Public Employees Retirement System and similar public pension systems throughout America are holding a number of malevolent Russian and Chinese enterprises in their portfolios for state employees. This has come about because the interest is in return on investment. And the position that Russia and China enjoy in the emerging markets, in the case of China, the lead player in the emerging markets. But that's no excuse for choosing to have in your portfolios serious, egregious human rights abusers and country and activities that have contravened the vital security interests of the United States. I mean, we have, for example, in the IPERS, Iowa Public Employees Retirement System, 8 Russian sanctioned companies, sanctioned by the United States, that you're not allowed to do business with them by law, but you're able to invest in them, you're able to fund them, you're able to give them all the prestige of being in the world's most voluminous and deepest markets, something they take to the bank every day around the world as the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. Far from sanctions, these are rewards. In the case of China, it's a much bigger problem by orders of magnitude. There might be 25 Russian companies in the U.S. capital markets. Compare that to probably over 1,000 in the case of China. There are reports that estimates that as much as $3 trillion of Americans' savings and investment funds have been extracted from the U.S. markets in the form of equity and debt offerings, stocks and bonds, that they have put in our marketplace and move that money into China for their seemingly unlimited checking account to move around the world, compromising countries, capturing nations, capturing regions and continents, like if you take Africa. In other words, a malevolent use of those funds. The reason that they're a near-peer competitor with the United States militarily, or striving to do so, and are trying to do the same in the technology field, is because we're picking up that tab. I mean, this is the sad truth of the matter. The U.S. capital markets, it's important to remember, have over 60% of the world's liquidity. All of the capital markets of the world combined are not the size of ours. So it's not as though China has someplace else to go. When the 21st century rolled around, we had all the money. It's one of the great last monopolies of the United States, in the sense that we have this absolute dominance in this financial domain on this planet. China knows this. They're in desperate need of dollar liquidity. They are not tapping that $3 trillion in reserves. They need that there to ward off actual diligence being performed by the people that want to do business with them. So they don't touch that. And I can tell you that they don't have all kinds of walking around money that seems to be limitless when you look at their activities. So state public pension systems are a wonderful boon to the Chinese economy, to its military, to its intelligence services, and to their effort to undermine our vital interests, to put them in a position where they could actually defeat the United States and put at risk, if not destroy, all that we hold dear. The stakes couldn't be higher. I mean, we're talking about, again, trillions of dollars, not hundreds of billions, or certainly not tens of billions. So when we look at each of the public pension funds, and I don't mean to single out Iowa as having been particularly egregious or malfeasant, this is true of your 49 other state counterparts. So you have lots of company, but the point is that you need to look at this because there's been no screening mechanism set up in your state or the other states to look at the material risks to share value and corporate reputation to these Chinese and Russian enterprises that are associated with human rights and national security abuses of this kind. That's what puts American investors at risk, is material risk. This isn't just an ideological conversation I'm having. It's a market-oriented, sensible, risk-related conversation. And that is something that any fiduciary should care about. This is not politicizing your pension system. This is not contracting your investable universe. This isn't jeopardizing the free flow of capital around the world. All of the arguments that Wall Street wants you to believe. That's just not the way this is. This is about risk. And more importantly, it's also about callousness. I mean, for example, Iowa PERS holds Hikvision Technologies. Now, what do they do for a living? Well, one of the things they do is if you look at the concentration camps in Xinjiang that are holding over 1 million Uyghurs, you're going to find at the top of these walls, along with barbed wire, every few meters are Hikvision surveillance cameras. If you talk about facial recognition technology at train stations in Tibet, rounding Tibetans up, you'll find the company as well. Is this something that the people of Iowa had in mind with their retirement dollars to support concentration camps? Another of your companies is AV China. It's short for AVIC, is the, well, I should say the short form name. China Aviation and Technology, something like that. But nevertheless, the point is, what do they do for a living? Well, they make the DF-41 ICBM that has half an hour flying time to American cities and American families. You have fighter aircraft. Iowa PERS also holds China Shipbuilding. They make nuclear ballistic missile submarines. They make nuclear aircraft carriers for a living. Now, where do we think that these kinds of advanced weapon systems are going to be directed? They're directed at us. So this is more than just again, a purely financial argument, but the whole thing can be justified, I think, in market practices and what should be SEC regulations that are enforced on ensuring the disclosure of these material risks at minimum to the people of Iowa and, for that matter, to the people of the United States. I mean, how many people do we have on the markets today in our country? 150, 180 million Americans, something of this kind? Do you know, China is racing to extract or to make us more dependent on their stocks and bonds. They're flooding, if you will, our market with dollar-denominated bonds as well as new equity offerings. Again, at the end of the day, this is fundraising. If they were to attract, as they want to, $2 to $3 trillion more in the next, say, 24, 36 months, you could have a day where Americans wake up, all 150, 180 million of us, and find that 17%, 22%, 25% of our retirement portfolios, of our investment portfolios, are all in Chinese securities. A number of them bad actors. Now just imagine that day when the China lobby, as it's famously called, has scores of millions of Americans joining in because of their vested financial interest in opposing future sanctions or penalties against China, independent of the severity of the offense. Why? Because they're worried about the damage to the value of their investment portfolios. Do we really think that China's not alert to this stealthy effort to make us beholden to them? Do we really believe that they won't use that kind of leverage if they have it? I mean, you see the way they saber rattle about withdrawing in one fell swoop their $1.1 trillion in treasury bills, for example. Of course, it wouldn't have that draconian effect as they like us to believe, but nevertheless, they are all about using whatever leverage they have to ensure that they maintain unfettered access to dollar liquidity and the vast capital markets that we have in our country that are, again, second to none, and where they have nowhere else to go. So I would think that during this period when presidential candidates are rolling through the states, they should be asked, what's their position on the fact that we have hundreds, if not, over 1,000 Chinese companies, some of them, again, bad actors by any measures, human rights abusers, national security abusers. What are we doing about the fact that we've never screened them out, even though they represent an asymmetric material risk to share value and corporate reputation? These companies in China don't disclose their financials. They're regarded as state secrets. How do you perform diligence on them? They don't adhere to PCAOB audits, which all of our American corporate counterparts have to be part of or subject to if they're going to participate in the U.S. capital markets. What about the fact that China's not complying with Dodd-Frank and Sarbanes-Oxley, U.S. securities laws? Do you think that our companies can get away with that? Think again. No way. So China's receiving preferential treatment. Presidential candidates should be asked why. This conversation is more important than the trade portfolio. I know trade's getting all the attention, but it's the shiny object that China wants us concentrating on, because they can have that conversation and weather tariffs all day long, all year long, as they've proved. They don't like the technology restrictions, as we're waking up to the fact that they're stealing us blind on the technology front, and they're using it right into their advanced weapon systems and other malevolent purposes. So they don't like that. But the one issue that they're most concerned about, I would argue that the one that they can least afford to ever see the light of day is the money. And it was the same case with the Soviet Union. I mean, why do we really think the Soviet Union went down? They were bankrupted in large part by the Reagan administration. And that story hasn't been fully told, but believe me, the Chinese have a voracious appetite for dollars. Their currency is not convertible. So I would only say that we have to be vigilant and disciplined in the way we do business with China, just as we are on the trade front. At least it has the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States that's trying to screen and monitor what kind of investments they can have that don't compromise our security interests. Well, where is that screening mechanism on the cap markets? Non-existent. Where's the intelligence community looking at who's coming into our markets and profiling them to find out who are they really? What kind of abuses have they been involved in? What about their subsidiaries? AVIC, that I was mentioning to you earlier, has been sanctioned by the United States on 5 previous occasions for reasons of proliferation of weapon systems. ZTE is the same. China Unicom is owned by Iowa PERS, and they're responsible for telecommunications and air defense communications in the South China Sea. They're the only internet provider for North Korea. Is that a company that Iowans feel comfortable holding in their portfolios? So there's a lot of data available here. I mean, there's stocks, there's bonds, there's exchange-traded funds. There are ones that you hold actively in the sense that you choose those individual stocks, and there are ones that appear in index funds. So we have this information. We're happy to share it with you and plan to. But the people of Iowa need to go to their state legislators, and the state legislators themselves need to become activists on this and maybe put Iowa in a leading position of caring about this issue. I mean, we have to care about, where our money is going and how it's being used. I mean, this is just rudimentary. And yet, it's never seen the light of day. You've never heard a conversation about it, I dare say. You've never seen a state legislature debate. You've never seen it on TV. You've never seen it in one interagency meeting in Washington. You've never seen it in one congressional hearing. And before March of this year, when we started to go public with our research findings, you didn't find it in any article or any media outlet. So again, we're in new territory here, but this is the motherlode. This is the most coveted China dream, to quote President Xi, that they have, is to load us up with their stocks and bonds so that, in effect, we're beholden to them. And at the same time, they get the kind of vast funding that they need to maintain this seemingly invincible juggernaut that's appeared on the horizon to challenge us in every sphere and to put at risk our primacy in the world and to defeat our way of life. Let's face it. I mean, this is a totalitarian or authoritarian, to be sure, police state, and it's not pretty. And even on those that don't care about national security should darn right care about human freedom. What about the surveillance state that's being funded here? What about those concentration camps? So this is a bipartisan issue. This is an American issue. And I urge you, all of you, to take it seriously, and those journalists to write about this, and let's get these statistics and these facts out there, because they're not my opinion. They're empirical. That's the beauty of finance. You can write them down, and there they are. And then you can just choose what you're going to do. And I certainly hope that the audiences that are going to view this today will take this seriously and understand that we're in this together, and we need to be vigilant. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger Robinson. A very important contribution. As we look at this sort of portfolio, if I can use that expression, of what China is up to, we've heard from Joseph Bosco about the various historical as well as current activities that are so deeply problematic, arising in part from this idea that if we just engage with China enough, all will be well. We've heard what it has meant to the people of China from Dr. Sean Lin about the Chinese use of technologies and the social credit system and other really horrifically oppressive techniques, organ harvesting among them, and how that is affecting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. Most immediately in China, but now as these techniques and mechanisms are being exported by China to others around the world now as well. And finally, we've heard from Roger Robinson about how much of this is being made possible through investments by mostly, let's be clear, unwitting individuals and perhaps even institutional investors. And I would like to think that's true of the Iowa Public Employee Retirement System. We're here to ask the question, do Iowans care about that reality? Do they want their money contributing to these sorts of problems? Do they want their retirement funds, especially their own personal financial future, to be so perilously invested in hostile companies doing malevolent things and enabling thereby the kinds of threats, existential threats to freedom that Communist China and the party that rules it is engaged in? So with that, I want to ask a few questions. There may be some from our audience as well, but we would like to specifically make sure a couple of other points that we've touched on in the course of this conversation are developed a little more fully. I would like to ask about this possible link between a biological weapons program in China and the coronavirus. Dr. Lin, you're a specialist in these matters. There isn't supposed to be a biological weapons program in China. China is a signatory to the Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits the development and manufacture and stockpiling of biological weapons. And yet, according to some press reports that we've seen just in the past 24 hours, there's a very active biological weapons program in China, some of it based in Wuhan, not far from the open-air market where we're told ground zero of this coronavirus incident was. So can you shed any further light on what China is doing in this space and whether it may, in fact, be contributing to a possible pandemic that will be a scourge for God only knows how many people around the world?
So overall, just in the last few years, Chinese government has realized they need to compete with the world in many fronts, especially in AI and biotechnologies. So they've been treating the biotechnology as one of the core features for their development plan 2025 for AI technologies, and also the Chinese government always say they want to stick to the biological weapon conventions. But however, there are always a group of hawkish military officers actually driving these efforts, just like what they claim that the war can be unrestricted warfare with the world, so any means works. So biological weapons is one of the tools. And so Chinese militaries has been using anthrax as a bioweapon potential, botulism as well. Those has been program active for a while. It just they didn't disclose to the public, even though they signed on the biological weapon convention. But in the last few years, SARS becomes another potential, coronavirus become another potential, because there are more research into the coronavirus in the past few years, have better understanding of the transmissions and the mutation routes in viral glycoprotein, amyloid proteins. And so there are studies published in 2017 saying that even in one cave in Yunnan province, that's in the southwest of China, you can see all the recombination can happen just in one cave of beds. And so you can see it can lead to another like SARS-like coronavirus. So this time, the Canadian case, the espionage case, the scientists shipping the dangerous virus back to China is also brought into the question. Why elite scientists? Because these scientists she's awarded by governors in Canada. So why elite scientists want to take the risk and bring the virus back to Wuhan, to the Institute of Virology, to the National Microbiology Lab? Why she want to take the risk? Right, must be a government very, very interested program, and so she had to take the risk to do this kind of very, very dangerous actions because shipping the biosafety level 4 pathogen is no small task. Nobody can imagine you can escape a surveillance shipping a biosafety level 4. So she must take a huge risk for doing that. So must be a national government interested in wanting this virus in China to either as a study model or further development. So that's why we really question the connection there, and especially it happens in Wuhan, right? The study sites at Wuhan. And also in recently, China also have laboratory leak cases, like in other provinces, they have Brucella leak from the laboratories. And in China, in 2004, they also have leakage on the SARS as well, even after the outbreak. So this time, maybe more than leakage, but maybe a connection with biological weapon, but just need to find out more information.
Yeah. Well, we definitely need more information. There are reports that these Chinese nationals were allowed into these very sensitive facilities in Canada, and yet we're actually working for the biological weapons program in China. This is a story that we'll be following closely at the Committee on the Present Danger. China, as I think will hopefully others. Joe Bosco, let me ask you about something that you touched on that I think Roger has emphasized is among the activities that is being financed by our capital markets. That's this Belt and Road Initiative. What is that exactly, and what does China have in mind achieving with this kind of program?
Well, as I mentioned, it's theoretically a revival of the old Silk Road trade routes that China engaged in, and that Europe, reciprocal European and China endeavor back in the centuries ago. In fact, the way it works, China offers extremely generous financial conditions and loans to poor countries that desperately need the money for infrastructure development. But when they sign on the dotted line, they find that eventually they are unable to meet the terms of the loans, pay the interest and pay the principal back. So then the conditions that China has imposed come into play, which is, in return for you not being able to pay your debt to us, we'd like to take over that port or the highway or the airport or whatever. And this has happened in several places around the world. It's called the debt trap. And it's worked very well for China. Some countries are now waking up to it, and the word is spreading. I saw a recent article that Brazil has objected to the terms of a Chinese loan. So it's part of Xi's overall scheme to reassert China's so-called dominant role in the world. That his China dream is there's one China and it's going to control the world, and the rest of the countries need to pay attention to that, and the United States needs to get out of the way. And we are, of course, their primary opposition. I want to comment, if I can, briefly on the virus spread that's now underway. When I was at the Department of Defense, one of my portfolios was humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And we had to address the outbreak of various pandemics and epidemics that occurred during that period. There's an article in today's Wall Street Journal by my former boss, Paul Wolfowitz, who was the deputy secretary at the time, indicating that Communist China's practices of withholding information and lack of transparency during times of epidemics makes the situation far worse. And they talk in the article about the 1918 flu epidemic that was caused in large part by governments not letting the world or the publics know that this was going on and they had to take precautions. China is doing that now, has done that now with this epidemic. But when I was at DOD, we saw the same practice of China on SARS, on avian flu, on swine flu, on HIV/AIDS. Every time there's a widespread medical emergency, China closes the books, closes the cameras, closes the communications, so people don't know about it, and therefore people can't take proper precautions. Taiwan is totally the opposite. Taiwan is absolutely transparent, gets the information out as quickly as possible, and of course it's one of the reasons China does not want Taiwan in the World Health Organization, because it, by contrast, would demonstrate how badly China meets its responsibilities not only to its own people, but to the international community.
Just one point. The Chinese government actually regarding the public health crisis as a national secret. That's why they control the information.
Yeah, that state secret thing is a big problem. Roger was talking about the fact that there's a lack of disclosure and transparency, particularly with respect to material risk in these Chinese companies, and that's because the Chinese tell us their state secrets too, the character and financial status, the accounting of these firms, and we are nonetheless allowing them to borrow money from us to fund them. I want to pick up on the point about Taiwan that Joe just made with you, Congressman King. I know over the years you've spent a fair amount of time in and on the subject of Taiwan. I think you're as concerned as we are at the Committee on the Present Danger of China about the threats that the Chinese government is now increasingly expressing. It's been described here as more and more overt to actually use force to unify Taiwan with the island, not reunify, unify the island. As an Iowan, as a man who, as you said, is very strongly committed to ensuring that the people of this state have the opportunity to sell their agricultural products, particularly to China, I'd ask you, in the event China were to invade Taiwan, what are the likely implications for our future sales of agricultural commodities, or much of anything else for that matter, to China? And if it's adverse, doesn't that make for a pretty powerful argument for people who want that kind of trade to continue to help us deter China from engaging in these kinds of malevolent activities towards Taiwan or anybody else for that matter?
Well, thank you, Frank. And the shortest answer, and then I'll go back to the longer one, but the shortest answer was we lived through this before. It was called the 1980s farm crisis, when Jimmy Carter embargoed all of the sales to Russia. And we saw our markets drop to the bottom. There were some 3,600 banks closed in the country that year. My bank was closed April 26, 1985, Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. But I have a vague memory of that, as you can't tell. But I think it's important as the generations go by, we lose track of what some of the foundation of this is. And my father fought in the South Pacific, and he paid a lot of attention to what was going on there. He made sure I knew. But the battle that Joe referenced was Mao versus Chiang Kai-shek. And for those who don't remember this, the freedom-loving Chinese people finally had to escape the mainland China, and they went to the Isle of Formosa. Formosa now is Taiwan. These are still freedom-loving people. And when I go there and I say to them, well, I reference the people on the mainland as the Red Chinese, and they say, we have some different names for them, but you should not repeat them. That tension exists. There's no question. It's ideological opposites. I've always stood up for and loved freedom-loving people. And and what has happened in Taiwan is they've moved into they're a modern nation. Their technology is as modern as anyone's. They've got some very good innovations over there too. They're creative and modern. That happens with the Western psychology, not so much with any other. So I see that happening in Taiwan. They have rebuilt. I was there for the 70th anniversary of their victory over the Japanese, which I hadn't read that history closely enough to realize that, but President Mao welcomed me, and I was a U.S. dignitary for that. It was a great experience, and I've been back since, and met with the newer president who was just reelected, President Tsai, and I like the relationships we have with Taiwan, but here's how they are under serious threat from the mainland, and how imminent this might be is, I leave that to people that have more hands-on, eyes-on. But I look across the straits, and from Kinmen you can see clear over to the mainland China. It's easily within artillery range, conventional artillery range, let alone missile range. And so I've looked across those straits, and I've talked with the Taiwanese military. But the thing that impressed me the most was about 10 years ago, I hosted a breakfast in Washington, D.C. for the Chief Justice of the Red Chinese Supreme Court. I presented him an autographed copy of my Constitution, which I carry in my pocket. I had to refresh it after that, and he said, our Constitution's like yours. I've read your Constitution, they match. Well, the difference is we follow ours, and they do not. But when we got to the discussion of Taiwan, his eyes turned black and cold. And he made sure I knew they see Taiwan as just as a part of the mainland, a part of the Chinese ownership, a part of their destiny. And looking into those eyes that day in that discussion, I think showed me into the soul of the leadership in China. And I believe they are focused on taking Taiwan one day. How soon, I don't know, but Taiwan won't stand up very long if they do. I've looked at their military, their aircraft, the logistics, and what all is stacked up against them across the straits. And so I've also, in Taiwan and in Washington, D.C., I've given speeches and strengthened the relationship between Taiwan and expanded our trade agreements with Taiwan. In fact, we increased our soybean sales to Taiwan last year by 37%. And that's, Iowans appreciate that. The entire soybean belt appreciates that. Here's the other side. We want to trade. When we trade, economies get stronger on both sides. Relationships get stronger. We become stronger friends with Taiwan. But a component of their defense is not just their military that's there, they're kind of sitting ducks to what's lined up against them, or their limited aircraft that they have and the defense mechanisms that they have. And they are, I think, they'll be a fierce fighting people. But also, the stronger the relationship is with the United States, the stronger their national defense is, because our relationship with Taiwan strengthens that bond so that the mainland Chinese are less likely to launch that kind of a military assault. So I want a strong trade relationship, strong friendship, and strong commitment to this. And one day, I want to see the folks that were at Tiananmen Square 30 years ago, those who survived, walk back out on that square and onto a free red China That's what I hope to see one day. We were close in 1989, and hopefully we'll live to see this in the future.
Congressman King, thank you very much. Let me just close with one other very important data point about this existential threat to freedom that I believe we are, in fact, facing from Communist China. One of our colleagues in the Committee on the Present Danger of China, who couldn't be with us here today, but has been very active and contributes very mightily to our public policy deliberations and inputs, is a woman by the name of Rosemary Gibson. She has co-written a very important book entitled China RX, which describes our dependency as a nation now on Chinese supplies of medicine. Specifically, China is now essentially the sole supplier of generic medications and components for an awful lot of other still branded, patented pharmaceuticals that are prescription drugs, as well as penicillin, as well as even vitamin C. This didn't just happen. This is a perfect example, a microcosm to be sure, but a perfect example of one of the forms of asymmetric warfare. You mentioned, I think, Sean, unrestricted warfare, which is the title of a book that was written back in 1999 by two colonels at the time, senior colonels in the People's Liberation Army, now senior generals in the Chinese military, that enumerated, I think, something like 20 different techniques that China could use to wage unrestricted warfare against the United States, even if they didn't have the military strength to contend with us in the old-fashioned kinetic form of warfare. Virtually every single one of these forms of warfare have, in fact, been applied by the Chinese in the intervening period. Much of it under, as Joe said, the hide and bide strategy of Deng Xiaoping. But this is a form of unrestricted warfare that isn't sort of an abstraction, that isn't something that might or might not bear on you personally or your family. Our dependency on Communist China for medicine will touch all of our lives, directly, in many cases, if not indirectly. Think about it. We've seen the Chinese adulterate everything from drywall to dog food, flat screen displays to baby food, yes. Could they adulterate our medications in ways that could be harmful to us? Well, in fact, Rosemary Gibson has evidence that, for example, a prescription blood thinner has indeed been adulterated with murderous effect in our country. And then there's the problem that Rosemary Gibson has identified, that what happens if they just simply cease to supply medicines that are manufactured in China? They cut us off as an act of unrestricted or asymmetric warfare, perhaps. Or just simply say, as they did to the Japanese, rare earth minerals, sorry, they're not for sale to you. According to Rosemary, within about 3 weeks, the U.S. healthcare system would come to a screeching halt. Again, with catastrophic effects for millions of Americans. What we have laid before you, ladies and gentlemen, and we appreciate very much your attending this threat briefing by the Committee on the Present Danger of China, virtually or here with us, is, I believe, a compelling case that whoever the next commander-in-chief of the United States is going to be, whichever party, whichever political philosophy, they will confront as their most urgent national security priority, contending with the existential threat from Communist China. We believe, as we have now said repeatedly, Americans who are in the job at the moment of hiring that next commander-in-chief need to know now whether the candidates have a grasp of this problem and whether they are prepared to lead us in contending with it effectively. There's so much more to talk about in various other ways. Fentanyl, opioids, Chinese are producing and disseminating here with murderous effect, 70,000 of our people. We've talked a bit about intellectual property theft. We've talked about enabling the incarceration of millions of people in China and their brutal oppression, organ harvesting and so on. But there's no end to what we could talk about. There is an end to the time available to do it. I would simply commend to all of you for more on all of these points, including the one I just mentioned about China RX. Please visit the website of the Committee on the Present Danger China, which is presentdangerchina.org, for scores of short videos that describe these issues in detail. It's an incredible resource, and there will be more, including today's program, of course, there, and those that will be forthcoming in other states across the country as we take this threat briefing to other constituencies that also have a need to know. I want to thank Congressman King, Joseph Bosco, Sean Lin for their excellent participation in this program, as well as, of course, that of Roger Robinson via videotape. And thank you for taking the time to take this information aboard, and I hope take it to those elected officials, whether they're presidential contenders or whether they're your state representatives with responsibility for your public pension funds, and ask them, do they understand the nature of the challenge we're facing, and are they prepared to join us in trying to deal with this existential threat to freedom? For all of us here at the Committee on the Present Danger of China, this is Frank Gaffney. Thank you very much for your time today. Visit us again at presentdangerchina.org. Thank you.